Hey, good evening, everyone. Just call this meeting to order. Take a moment to acknowledge the Northern Rockies Administration Center is located in the heart of the traditional territory of the Dene, Cree, and Denisah people of Fort Nelson and Prophet River First Nations. We further recognize the rights provided by our treaty and also celebrate the contributions and the enduring presence of the Métis people in our region. Please be advised that tonight's meeting is available for the public to attend virtually and is being streamed and recorded. And just before we start tonight's agenda, I would like to take a moment on behalf of Mayor, Council, and staff to express our deepest condolences to our community members who have been impacted by the unthinkable act of violence at the Filipino celebration in Vancouver this past weekend. Please know our hearts are with you during this incredibly difficult time. Are there any additions to this agenda? Nope. Seeing none. Any comments from the public? Seeing none. We'll accept the agenda as printed. Yeah, why not? Perfect. Takes us to 5.1, Committee of the Whole Report, 1225, Asset Retirement Obligation Policy.
Good evening.
Hi, Tony. Good luck explaining this.
I've been sitting here for the last half hour trying to wrap my mind around the simplest way to explain this.
Yeah.
Really, what I think about first is a number of years ago, reporting standards identified that we needed to report our tangible capital assets, and as we use them, we amortize them over time. What they've also identified is that a lot of our assets could have obligations when we retire them. So for instance, if we have a building that was built prior to the 60s, it could have asbestos in it, probably does have asbestos in it. And what the reporting standards are saying is that we need to, first of all, take a look at our existing inventory and come up with a plan of what we're doing with our existing inventory and identify if we have any legal obligations when we are ready to retire an asset. So the assumption is that at some point in time, an asset will no longer be used. It will need to be removed, destroyed, taken out of service. If there's a legal obligation to deal with some sort of environmental issue, things like that, that's when we're talking about identifying what those liabilities are. So this standard says to us, first of all, take a look at our properties that we already own, where what we're doing is we're taking a look at buildings that were built prior to a certain date. We have a few hazmat reports that we can draw upon for some of our buildings to give us some guidance. We're looking to see if we have any buried fuel tanks, which we don't have any, actually. It deals with water wells and it deals with landfill. So those are the areas that we've been investigating. And there are very few areas that we will be reporting. But the concept is that we report there's a liability. The closer we get, so every year, as your asset retires, every year closer to that liability, your obligation is to increase the amount you're setting aside so that you have funds to draw upon when it's time to retire the asset. So that's the basic concept on what we're doing with assets we already own. And then on a look forward basis, we'll be incorporating the same sort of review into assets that we're acquiring. If there are any legal obligations that deem it necessary for us to retire them and pay for that retirement. So we did a lot of digging. We have a lot of agreements for different pieces of property. And it was determined that I use the skateboard park, for instance. I look at the skateboard park and I see that that's a large piece of concrete, and do we have an obligation what obligation do we have at the end? Well, right now, it's still a skateboard park. And until the intended use of that piece, that asset changes, we're not about to retire it. So that, for instance, is one that we leave out at this point. So we've had a lot of discussions back and forth. We've had a consultant work with us. The report identifies that we were unable to get a clean audit report last year because the investigation for the buildings and those other areas weren't fully undertaken. And the auditor wasn't able to give us a clean audit report. So we're looking at getting the blessing of council for this policy. And in the meantime, we're finalizing the work for the financial statements to be able to bring them forward to council and obtain that clean audit report this year.
Well done.
Did I
Question?
get
You
it?
did good. Yeah, you simplified that. For me anyways. Yeah. Mayor, did you have any questions?
Yes, I do.
Perfect.
I guess the first thing that set me back a little bit was the audit report and the fact that we didn't get a clean audit report. I recall him telling us that we did. So did that change partway through the year?
The audit report, the audited financial statements that went to council in June of 2024 had a qualification in them. And those are these statements that were published on the website, our website.
Right.
So we do have a qualification in them for last year.
I'm trying to remember if the auditor, did he make a report or did that all happen right during the evacuation? Because it surprises me that we had a qualified audit. But anyways, it is what it is.
Yeah.
Whether it changed or not. I guess I need to go into the policy under the recognition portion. Because I think it's important that we follow this recognition bit, and there's terms in there that I'm not fully familiar with respect to because I just don't use them obviously enough.
Sure.
But to me, reporting a liability is an important part of your financial statements. And so, I look to the sentence after the last bullet that says liability for an asset retirement obligation cannot be recognized unless all of the criteria above are satisfied. So can you take us through those 4 criteria and give us a bit of an idea what they are?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So the first one is a legal obligation to incur retirement costs. So for instance, when we talk about a building built prior to 1960 that we find has asbestos, we have a legal requirement. We have an obligation to dispose of and handle material in a certain way. That is over and above what we would normally do if we were demolishing a building. So our obligation is set out within the different legislation that requires us to, we know right off the bat that legal obligation requires us to spend more money when we retire that asset. So that would be the first one. Legal obligations also. So for instance, with the water wells, there's legal obligations that must be fulfilled when a water well is decommissioned. And it is that legal obligation that would require us to recognize a liability, review that liability on an annual basis. And the word they use is accretion. And so where TCAs are amortized, the AROs we have accretion where we add to that liability. So that's the first one. A past transaction or event giving rise to the liability. So this is exactly what we're talking about now. What they needed to ensure was that we would go backwards in time and identify any liabilities that exist up to this date. It is expected that the future economic benefits will be given up. It is expected that when we get to that point in time, we will be required to come up with those funds to retire the asset for those special conditions. And that a reasonable estimate of the amount can be made. So we can identify, for instance, in a building that there is asbestos in the flooring. And we can make a reasonable estimate what we would pay for those particular costs to be to remediate that at retirement. So those would be the 4 that we would need to be able to fulfill.
So they all, yeah, okay. So they all have to, all of those things have to be true before you recognize it as a liability.
That's
So
right.
if we're not, the landfill, yeah, we know someday we're going to have to shut it down, but as long as we're continuing operating that landfill according to then there's no reason for us to recognize it as a liability because we're not.
We do know that we have a legal obligation to remediate the site. So
Right.
number 1 is true. Number 2, it's a past transaction, whether it's a past transaction or we enter into it. And number 3, we know there's going to be a cost to it. So we're going to have to give up future economic benefits. We're going to have to raise taxes in the future if we don't plan for it all the way along. And we have the ability to have consultants identify the reasonable estimate of that amount. So we're able to, on a landfill, satisfy all 4 of those requirements.
Tony, I think the landfill is a good example because the landfill legislation required to have the landfill closure provisions in place have been in place for quite some time now. And that liability has been on the books for quite some time, specific to the closure requirement that if we were to close, like, to the mayor's point, I guess, to kind of put it in perspective for the rest of council, is that landfill is currently active, but we're also required to show in the books if we were to close a landfill tomorrow, that we actually have the funds available to deal with the closure provisions to appropriately remediate it. And then for the 25-year minimal 25-year window that you have to, we're required to inspect and ensure that it meets the environmental requirements. So we have to show those funds, which is a calculation done by the environmental engineers, right?
Yeah, but there's the rub. There's the rub. Potentially, you're starting to put aside into reserves a significant amount of money to remediate some of these. And so it seems to me that in order to potentially avoid that, you keep it open so that you don't realize the future economic benefits being given up. Like if you never have to tear a building down, you never have to. It doesn't fit with the 4. See what I'm saying? Is that, you know, I don't necessarily agree that we want to.
So
That we want to identify every single asset that potentially. It's just such a huge number. It boggles my mind.
So here's the rub. The rub when we did TCAs was that we were identifying historical costs for assets to put on the books. And to a lay person or a business person, it did not make sense. But the requirement is there. And what that piece has done is it's given us the ability now to look at our infrastructure deficit. With the asset retirement obligations, they're not saying day 1, you've got to allow for the cost of retirement in 55 years. They're saying you've got to identify that cost in 55 years and begin to build towards it. So it's taking a smaller approach to it. And then it's reviewed on a consistent basis. So if you're dealing with that building with asbestos that you might get rid of in 80 years, and in 40 years, you're looking at it, you've looked at every year up to 40 years, and it still has an 80-year window. You're constantly revising those estimates as you go along to increase for inflation and to decrease for an extended lifespan. And
Oh, sorry,
you-
Tona. Sorry, were you done that explanation? Counselor Souls has a question.
Sure.
Oh, sorry, I just, if you could comment on, and it might bring more clarity yet, using the example of the landfill, because we have an old landfill and we have a currently used landfill. So those two, how would those be looked at differently from each other regarding where the explanation that you just gave?
Absolutely. So your closed landfill, we know we still have an obligation. What if we I hate using the word pretend, but let's pretend that AROs were set up and we closed the landfill in 2025. We now have got a liability sitting there waiting to be, it's identified that we need to pay for that over time. So we've expensed it as we've gone along, and we've adjusted that liability so that when time comes to fund that, we're reducing our liability as we're funding that closure. With the open landfill, we're building that liability to the point where we get to an eventual closure. Does that provide the two sides?
Yes, that does. And just a second comment is that the the idea of reserve funds and interest on reserves is the offset to the increased need to keep adding to these liability funds. Is that, do you see that connection as part of it?
It can be. It's interesting that the standard doesn't talk about it being a reserve fund, talks about it being directly a liability attributed to an asset.
Hmm.
So when we took a look at the assets that we have outside of landfill, I think we have 10 assets that we will be recording a liability on. There will be a quarry, 3 or 4 buildings, and some closed landfills.
Are those landfills from when we
Up highway.
became the up highway ones? Yeah, when we became a municipality.
Oh, go ahead, Counselor Ripper.
Just to the mayor's point earlier, I do see in the excerpt here, it says that they have modified their audit opinion accordingly. So perhaps this was an afterthought from the time that we received the initial report, because I don't recall
Yeah, I don't.
anything like this. As far as I was aware, we had a clean audit. So I guess I have one question just about the logistics. You mentioned the skate park, for an example.
Yes.
That we wouldn't have to list that. And I'm wondering what the difference is between, let's say, a landfill and a skate park, when with the skate park, you've got concrete and rebar and fencing, and it could become a hazard. And is there not an obligation for that asset? And what is the big picture difference between those two things?
Well, with your skateboard park, as it potentially has the opportunity to deteriorate, you are renewing it. You're bringing it back to that state that it was when it was first constructed. And our skateboard park is on leased land as well. So that was one of the other wrinkles that we took a look at. And you know, I have to honestly say, the skateboard park might be one of the ones that we do have on our list. The water wells are for sure. And I'm thinking right now, skateboard park might not be the best one to use. But the other piece, and I don't know if it makes any sense, it's about those natural obligations. If we go and we ruin an asset, for instance, and we have an obligation to repair it and remediate it and you know, wreck it, have it, if we have an obligation to pay certain costs when we're done using it, that's not a retirement cost. That's not a legitimate retirement cost. A legitimate retirement cost is that we have created a water well. We know that at some point in the future, no, pardon me, we know that there's an obligation to deal with that water well in a legislated manner when it comes to the point in time that we're not going to use it anymore. And that really is our difference, is our legislated requirement to deal with it at the end.
One more follow-up question, if you will. What happens if we don't do this? If we just leave it the way it is, will we
Yeah.
just continue to get qualified?
Yeah.
Like what happens?
Yeah, absolutely. So with tangible capital assets, Northern Rockies was the last in the province to bring our financial statements up to the standards, and we received a qualified audit report for a number of years. And we need, from my perspective, I think the Northern Rockies needs clean audit reports. We're dealing with the province in some very substantial agreements, funding agreements. And we need to be seen to be following the standards identified for reporting, financial reporting.
Great. Thank you very much for the answers. Appreciate it.
Councillor Schultz, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to just pop a question regarding the old swimming pool and see if it's on the list.
That was mine too.
Because you see, it's an interesting case because we've retired it for its original purpose, which actually resulted in us purchasing it or purchasing the land that it sat on because it was actually a Crown grant at the time. And we as a municipality purchased the land in order to keep from being required to destroy the old building and haul it to the landfill. So now we own an asset that's timed out. I mean, it's timed out for its original purpose and it's free and clear, but it's not used and it's still a swimming pool. So how are we gonna decide what we do with that?
Yeah, so I can let you know the assets that we've identified at this point. So we have the Town Square complex is on it because there is minor asbestos. The Aquatic Center is on it because of the asbestos as well in some of the different building features there. Poplar Hills Golf Course Clubhouse is on the list as a result of the age of the asset and the potential, because we have not done any hazmats there, for it to contain asbestos. The Fire Hall Public Works, we looked at the ceiling in the garage bay that has a product that contains asbestos. So we have an amount there. The airport storage garage, the old fire hall at the airport, is on the list. The airport terminal building, definitely for what we find in the basement. The airport maintenance garage has a minimal amount based on some tile. And then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 wells. And we'll have 1 quarry. So those are the buildings at this point.
Okay, so I don't know how to exactly word this, but you know, for the tax dollars that we're taking in, a certain percentage of them go to reserve funds. And now a certain percentage of that dollar is going to have to go to the asset retirement obligation. at what point in time do we get to, we have more future obligations than current ones? Because a dollar is only a dollar. You can only split it so many ways. And if we're splitting it up that 3/4 or 99 cents on every dollar is going for future planning, what leaves for today's living?
Absolutely. So, and Councillor Gerwing, that's an excellent question. When we deal with amortization and when we deal with accretion for the AROs, they aren't budgeted amounts. What we budget are our capital purchases and our contributions to the reserves. And so there's a thought that you either do one or the other. So we are not raising tax dollars for the amount of amortization, and we would not be raising tax dollars for the accretion expenses.
We essentially have to acknowledge them on the books.
We
As a
have
liability.
we have
Yeah.
to acknowledge them as a financial adjustment at year end.
So just, okay, just to,
to
but
follow
we
up.
don't have to put set aside an X amount of dollars to deal with that liability?
No.
Okay.
Because if you look at your financial statements, it'll outline where you have funds and how you are financially, and then it'll also show your liabilities. Obviously, if you have a significant amount of liabilities and you don't have other things in other areas to cover it, it's like being underwater in your mortgage, for example, or something like that, like, or having reverse equity, right? So at the end of the day, it's about, when you look at, you have to recognize the liability. So now I'll say that, do we agree with this process? No, and the previous CAO actually had some really strong words as a CJ in terms of the TCAs back in the day, for example, right? But the reality is, from a legislative requirement, we don't have an option not to, or we can't argue it, because some individuals and groups in a very high level from a financial perspective are making the rules. But that said, it's a lot of cases is also due to the fact that organizations, not necessarily just local governments, but organizations haven't recognized certain liabilities, and they haven't recognized them in the books and haven't had the ability to deal with those liabilities. It was why early on the landfill liability closure provisions were a requirement, because when it came time that our landfill had to be closed, there wasn't funds available to close it appropriately. I mean, the orphan well system is like probably a similar example, right? It's is government looking after doing what they can so they can properly remediate a site after it goes into the orphan well, so it doesn't sit there as just as an orphan well, right?
Hey, Danny, the mayor's got his hand up, and then you.
Yep, that's fine.
Go ahead, Mayor.
Yeah, thank you. It seems to me like, I don't know how else to put this. We're talking out of both sides of our face here. We're saying that we have to set up a liability because the requirement is for us to set up the liability. To me, if we're not setting up a way to look after that liability in the future, we're not being prudent. So back to Councillor Gerwing's question, or Deputy Mayor Gerwing's question, with respect to having the reserves, because I heard you say we have to have the money to be able to put this away later, to be able to look after it. So if you're recognizing a liability, sure, you can have assets to offset that liability, but by recognizing that liability, you're not obligated to prepare to put that liability to rest.
So it's an interesting concept that it's taken me a while to come to grips with. But if we were to create if we were to create an asset today that has a retirement obligation, what I do is I set up the cost of my asset, and added to the cost of my asset is the cost of my future retirement. So my asset now costs me what I paid out, what it costs me to build it, contract it, ship it in, and what it's going to cost me in the future to retire it. And at that point, I set up my asset and I set up my liability against it. And then I start depreciating my asset, and I start the accretion for my for my liabilities. So we're hitting a once only piece right now that we have to get our existing set up. But as we go forward, when we set up the asset, we're setting up our liability at the same time against it.
Yeah, that still doesn't, that's the accounting
know.
bit. I understand the accounting bit, but it
Mhm.
doesn't
That's
create
the
the
question. Yeah.
fund to look after it. Yeah, okay.
Totally. Totally.
Councillor Souls?
Well, I would say that this practice has been implemented on some of the government agencies like BC Hydro have been doing this for a long time in their asset as they design and build power lines, even on our private land and so on. The cost is much higher than it was when we first started because they're actually building into their new construction the end game as well of taking it apart when they're finished. And so this has been going on for quite a long time. And I think in a sense, like I can certainly see that the linkage, as the mayor is talking about, the linkage between where the actual funds are to take care of given any one of these existing liabilities that we are recognizing is not clear. The linkage of money to asset is not clear. Where would the money come from if you had to retire the airport shop or something like that? It's not clear linkage, but at this point, my overview of this says that, especially thank you for reading out the particular buildings and that where we're at. Just be thankful we're a young community that doesn't have hundreds of old buildings to deal with, because then we'd have a different discussion going on. We're talking primarily, not exclusively, but primarily the buildings that were part of the Second World War effort and so on. And so this is not near as scary when you look at the values of what it would take to dismantle any of those properties. It's not as though we're jeopardizing our reserves for building forward in other areas in this particular place.
Go ahead, Tony.
And if I can add, this will also add a nuance to our asset management plans. When we're looking at replacing that asset, our asset management plan should only be dealing with the normal replacement of that asset, because the retirement obligation is already being accounted for. So we will need to ensure that we recognize it correctly so that there would be a tendency to double dip, to add to your reserve to replace that building as well as add to the liability for the retirement obligation. So it will bring a nuance for these particular assets into the planning for capital planning.
Okay.
Anything else? I think we're all just kind of stuck in our brains trying to wrap our heads around something that doesn't necessarily follow the rules of common sense. So
We are talking finance, and that can be true.
yeah.
Yeah,
Mayor, did you?
yeah, just the last thing. I mean, the policy, I think is fine from the accounting perspective, to recognize these and to recognize them on the books so that then the auditor can give us a clean audit. So, that it just creates this other issue that we're going to have to deal with sooner or later, I believe. But with that accounting explanation put forward, then the policy makes sense from that perspective. But there's more to this than meets the eye for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'm gonna use some of Scott's words here, but we're currently reviewing sustainable service delivery, and this forms a part of that. As we go forward, we want to be looking at creating and purchasing assets that don't have retirement obligations. we don't want to create something, if we can help it, that would cause an environmental issue that has to be addressed later on, for instance. So I think it will meld into that sustainable service delivery piece as well.
Great. Okay. Anything else? Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
There was no new business and any public news, media questions? Seeing none, I would call this meeting adjourned. Okay. See you at 6:30.
Yep.